I have the pleasure of introducing and then also chatting with Keith today. Keith is the chairman at Ferrazzi Greenlight. He's an American entrepreneur and recognized global thought leader in the relational and collaborative sciences. As chairman of Ferrazzi Greenlight and its research institute, he works to identify behaviors that block global organizations from reaching their goals and to transform them by coaching new behaviors that increase growth and shareholder value. He was formerly the CMO of Deloitte and Starwood Hotels. And I think missing from his bio is also multiple New York Times bestseller list author. So welcome, Keith.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
So obviously there's a large group of individuals who are yet decided if this content's going to be interesting enough to stay, so they refuse to sit down, and I don't blame you. So we need to make sure that we can make the next, half an hour or so incredibly compelling for everybody out here. I'll probably be shouting out to you a number of times to get some of your questions so that we can feed something more customized for what you're interested in. But all right.
That sounds great. All right, so you have a lot of different experiences, but I think a lot of folks may have read your books. The first one being Never Lunch Alone.
Never Eat Alone.
Never Eat Alone.
Probably Never Eat Alone is the first book many people have read.
And then over the last few years, we have been told, eat separately, do everything separately, stay apart from one another. So that has definitely made that a little bit more challenging. We may dig into that. But your most recent book talks about leadership without authority and sort of this move from, an authoritarian leadership style to teamwork. What made you think that this is now the time to talk about that?
Yeah, you can move that. You're welcome to. So, look, I wrote a book about networking about 20 years ago. And if we wake up today as leaders, and any of you in this room who either lead an organization or want to lead a movement of change in the world in any way, you have to lead networks. Leadership isn't about people who report to you. It's about your ability to marshal people to give a damn about what you give a damn. Whether that's, you can be in a very large organization. I coach the executive teams of some of the world's largest organizations or fastest growing unicorns. And most leaders feel castrated because they don't have the capacity to direct, right? Because it's like herding cats. So where we are today in leadership is your ability to be a movement leader defines your ability to make a difference in the world. And so that's what I wrote the book on, Leading Without Authority, which we can double click on if anybody has questions about that in more detail. But today we work in networks.
We do. I think we're seeing some contrasting leadership styles certainly showing themselves off right now, right? So when I think about what is happening over at Twitter, that seems like the opposite of teamwork and the opposite of collaboration. And there are a lot of folks whispering or not so quietly talking about how maybe we should get back to that. Maybe we're getting too soft with our teams.
Let me put two different leaders up on a pedestal for a second. Jeff Bezos is one leader who's done an incredibly good job of scaling an incredibly effective organization. Would everybody agree with that? Yeah. There's another young man who's passed away during the pandemic who's a dear friend of mine. His name was Tony Hsieh. He created also an e-commerce company. It was called Zappos. And what he did with Zappos shoes was fundamentally design a company, not to create shareholder value, but he designed a company in order to accelerate the growth of humanity inside of the workplace. The customer wasn't number one, the shareholders wasn't number one, but it was the associate. And the elevation of the individuals that worked at Zappos was number one. Tony is considered one of the great entrepreneurs, and to the point where he actually sold his company to Amazon. And one of the reasons Amazon bought Tony is because they were curious about how he was able to get the level of employee engagement, the level of customer loyalty, all of the metrics that Amazon would want, he was able to achieve inside of Zappos, but with a fundamentally different way of doing it. In fact, he did it not through autocracy or control or dictation. He did it through this crazy idea of holacracy, where people could be self-managing. I mean, what the hell is that? And when I talked to Jeff at Amazon and asked him, well, what do you think about it? He said, listen, as Amazon scales, the biggest challenge of scaling Amazon is our managerial ranks and the ability to manage all of these people. What happens if the people could be self-managing? What if that happened? We would be able to scale Amazon more effectively. So Zappos became a laboratory. Now, I say both of those things, and I deeply, as all of us should deeply, respect both of those leaders. But they lead very differently. But what I can tell you is that for both of those cultures, joining those cultures is a choice. And you would do better in a Zappos culture, and you would do better in an Amazon culture, because you as an individual have to choose what that working relationship is, what that social contract is. I don't know if anybody's read the book Principles by Ray Dalio, right? And it's an incredible book, right? It's an incredible book. And I had an opportunity here at Davos last year to sit with Ray Dalio. And I said, Ray, I love your book. My clients love your book. But I've got a little bit of a problem. I've got to go into places like General Motors and try to get them to behave like you and have gotten your employees and associates to behave. I have a problem. General Motors doesn't hire assholes like you do. He runs an organization on challenge, on debate, right? And to some extent, some people who have gone to Ray Dalio's organization have quickly boomeranged out because they couldn't handle that kind of candor and transparency. So that's not for you, right? Look, we can have lots of conversations about Elon Musk's management style, right? And I don't understand it in its fullest.
Does anyone?
I hope he does, right? I hope he does. And we can actually double click into that if that's kind of fun. But I wanted to show you two very distinct types of leaders with two totally different philosophies of leadership that both work incredibly well. The question is, do you as an associate want to work with company A or company B given the contract that they have? And both social contracts in that instance ends up working. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And I think we've seen a lot of shifts in the workplace over the last few years, right? We probably can't cover all of those changes, but there do seem to be a shift in mindset from workers and how you have to inspire them to want to stay with your company. And then there's also been just a sort of shift overall in the general public and our discourse, and whether we are as kind and polite to one another as we should be. So if you were looking at that book and thinking about it today,
that's great.
How does that
Beautiful
change?
questions. By the way, you're great at facilitation. You've done your homework and you've got lots of good thoughts on this. Let me answer that question in two different ways. We'll call them the two shifts. Okay? So shift one is not the one you're talking about. It's a slightly different one, but I want to get on it. Or maybe I'll do shift one after so that we can segue into it if you have questions. But the shift that you're talking about is the awakening and the recognition that the social contract, the negotiation between associates and their work is different. Everybody, I'm talking about some of the hardest driving executives that I know, have changed their relationship with work. They're asking the question, why the hell am I doing this as like in the way that I've been doing it, right? How do I want to keep doing it in the way that I've been doing it? And we have awoken to the recognition, particularly when we got slammed during the pandemic, that mental health's important, right? Now, it's very interesting as we pendulum swing in the economy. I mean, remember, it was a period of time during the pandemic. It was difficult to recruit people. We had the Great Resignation, and everybody was kissing the butt of the associate to make sure that we created this environment, et cetera. But now, all of a sudden, we've got announced this morning the next set of significant layoffs, and it feels like the economic pendulum has shifted. But you have to, you don't hear about the Great Resignation anymore, right? But I don't think, there was something that I identified during the pandemic through having conversations with heads of HR of big companies. One particular one was the head of HR at Unilever named Mike Clementi. What was going on at that time was something that I call the movement of the great exploration. And that's still there. Back when the associate had a lot more leverage, they were exploring And because they were exploring, one of the ways that they were exploring was leaving the company because there was an abundance of opportunity elsewhere. They could leave the company and they could figure out what's better elsewhere. Well, right now, they may not be leaving, right? Because they don't feel that there's an abundance of opportunity. So the great resignation is not their solution to the great exploration. But what they are doing is they're still asking themselves the fundamental questions. Why am I doing this? What's the purpose, et cetera? So, and if you don't meet your associate around that fundamental exploration question, you're going to lose productivity and engagement. They just won't, their heart won't be bounding out of the bed, right, to get shit done and to create value for you if you don't lead with that great exploration. So I don't think things have changed. You still have to do that. You just might not be seeing people exit right now. Now, the second big shift didn't happen that should. We moved from fully physical work to fully remote work in the snap of a finger. It took less than a week for everybody to get equipped and everybody to be in their, hunkered down in their homes doing work. We changed where we worked. We did not change how we worked. Not changing, we did a study during the pandemic and identified we had 2,000 teams, and we were asking them, how have you changed the way you work? And what are the best practices that you've used to identify how you've changed your work? And the reality is only 15% of teams changed how they worked. There's still meeting-based collaboration. All of the old forms of ways of thinking about working just went from a room in an office to a room in Teams or Zoom, right? Now, that's what pisses me off. We had a great inflection point and a great opportunity to fundamentally reinvent the way we work. And what we missed was the curiosity to think that we could. For any of you who have an opportunity to influence an organization, small or large, you should ask yourself the following question. Not how do we make work as good as it used to be, because that will make it mediocre. The key is for you to say to yourself, how do I make work tomorrow so damn better than it ever has been? Once you get that kind of curiosity, I am gonna make work so better than it ever has been, then you ask yourself, how do I make onboarding better than it ever has been, right? How do I make meetings better than it ever has been? How do I make, whatever it is, how do I make career pathing? How do I make coaching? How do I make my employee development better than it ever has been? Once you get your mind and your people's mind to that, then we'll have the opportunity to realize of the shift we should have had but didn't. Only 15% of companies gave a damn about creating their work. Yeah.
Can you share some insights then as to how you feel that this paradigm shift should have manifested itself? Because ultimately, we all have projects that we have to deliver on,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, and there are ways that you do that, and typically,
I love it.
you get on a call, you set a direction, you divide the labor, you go off and do your bit, you come back, you share how you have got on, you bring that together, and then you test, is that right? And if not, you kind of go back.
By the way, the way in which you just represented work
Yeah.
is probably 75% more astute and aware than the average manager. So at least you think about how work happens. Right. In most organizations, they meander through work, but we'll come back to that. One of the things I want to tip my hat to with Chief of Staff Association is they care so deeply in helping chiefs of staff reinvent work in the organizations to which they are shepherding and ushering. So I wanted to tip my hat that all during the pandemic, Chief of Staff was iterating and creating a significant curriculum, coaching, et cetera, to help that reinvention. So thank you very much for that. So the answer to your, let me give you two very specific, for instances, of things that could have happened that didn't happen. And I'm gonna use one that everybody, I'm gonna use a soft one, and I'm gonna use one that's productivity oriented. Which one do you want first? Productivity or culture?
I think mine was more productivity.
Yeah, it was. So I'll start with productivity. So when we're launching a new project, we will often start that new project. Let's have a kickoff meeting, right? So we sit there and we say, okay, you're the leader, you've got a new project. We have a kickoff meeting. Who should I have invited to that meeting? 12 people, right? And Will might call them on Zoom or in a physical whatever. And so there you show up, right? Ready to tell those 12 people your vision for this project. Now, one of the things that at Fault you have already done is you've taken the most valuable, precious asset, the real estate of people sitting together. And you've wasted 12 people's time because you forced them to be physically co-located in one place at one time, but they're not talking, they're not collaborating, they're listening to you. That is a waste of time. That could have been shifted in the following way. You could have said, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna do a recording of my vision for this project's transformation. And what I believe the objectives, what I believe the shift needs to happen, whatever it is, you're gonna set this out. You're gonna do it in a video. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna take that video, and instead of calling a meeting of 12 individuals, you're gonna send it to those 12 people. And attached to that, you're gonna have a SharePoint document or a Google Doc. And in that Google Doc, you're gonna ask a question. Maybe I'll be flip. Where do I have my head up my ass? Like, where am I totally wrong in thinking about this project? Like, where are my risks? What are my challenges? I want you to answer that question. What innovations or ideas am I missing, right, is the second question. And the third question is, who else should be a part of this, right? They know that you've sent this out to 12 people. Who else should be a part of this? Who else has a dog in the hunt, all right? So now what happens? Had you had the meeting, the average meeting of 12 people, when exiting, 4 people will say that they had a chance to be heard. 4 people. In a case of a kickoff project, it's probably 2, right? Now what happens when you've sent out this asynchronous solicitation, right? You have 12 individuals thoughtfully engaged, helping you rethink the project. Now, if you had had the physical meeting, those 12 individuals would not have probably had the psychological safety. They wouldn't have had the contemplative time to argue and think constructively. And by the way, they'll probably have forwarded it along to another 10 people. So now the aperture of the meeting that you would have originally had of 12 people now expands to upwards of 30 individuals. And now you've got this rich tapestry of challenging insight, this rich tapestry of innovation and ideas, right, from a broader number of individuals that you would have ever invited. Had you had the meeting, it would have been the kickoff to subsequent meetings that would have gotten to not even that much information that you got in a simple 24-hour period using asynchronous collaboration. Does that make sense to you? It does. Now, how many executives have awoken to the realization that that original kickoff meeting was stealing from shareholders? Whereas this shifting to asynchronous collaboration is a massive unleashing of psychological safety, inclusion, innovation, ideation, and it's a decrease in the cycle time of getting shit done. Because now you're able to start the meeting with the real agenda. Now you come into the meeting and say, guess where I was wrong? Because you've showed me where I was wrong. I agree with all of these things you've just said. Forget what I said, I'm doing this. And by the way, guess where you're wrong? I'm the leader, and no, we are gonna go do this thing, and we are gonna talk about blah, 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 because that's the vision that we have. Thank you very much, but it's all good. We're in alignment now. No, which is fine too. And by the way, you've brought up a bunch of stuff that need to be curious, diving into more. I call that yes, no, maybe. Really simple. So anyway, I've just re-engineered your productivity question. Does that make sense to you?
It does.
Yeah. And that didn't happen. I'll get to the cultural piece if you want, but yeah.
So I have a concern for the next generation of workers that are coming up. And I'll give you an example. I work at a law firm. I own the IT shop. I own the innovation shop. We're fine. We were always working remotely. The partners and the rest of the staff like that who were on the cloud, they moved to the cloud, they're working remotely. There's 2 things that are real problems. One is for everybody, there's an expectation now that you're always available all the time because your office is basically like the refrigerator. You cruise past it, you look, and you can go eat or you go work. That's one thing. And the other one is that if people are not coming into the office and you have someone like an associate who needs face-to-face and an extreme amount of tutelage, they're not getting that anymore. And you're basically putting your organization, in my view, at risk because you are not grooming the next generation.
Well, I'll go through both of those. How do you solve for the always on, and I think everybody would agree, all these jerks that are saying, my people, there's this huge gap that Microsoft identified, and where the 85% of managers don't think people are working enough and hard enough because they're not around at work, and 85% of workers feel that they've never been more stressed in the world and they're working too much. So there's this little bit of a gap, right? But what's interesting, this issue of we're always on, we will equalize to a balance. This pace that people have of always on can't be sustained. It just can't. And it'll be fine. I mean, it's very, it's challenging right now, discontinuous right now. It's a bitch right now. But we're gonna find the equalization, and it'll probably have a few mental breakdowns and heart attacks between now and then, but the world will find its equalization. I do. I mean, look, what we found in a hybrid work world is the systemization of caretaking, personal self-care, is really important. You need to schedule your workouts and put it on your calendar, and it needs to be sacrosanct. You need to schedule. I actually send a message to my organization, which sounds a little quirky, but if I look at my calendar, I'll put in a 15-minute nap. It's my cuddle nap, because my partner and also works out of the house when we're working together, and we both coordinated our cuddle naps. And so for 15 minutes, I get to run away from the computer. We lie down and we just close our eyes. We get 15 minutes of just being there together, right? And I put that on my calendar. Why would I put that on my calendar? That sounds ridiculous to put that on your calendar, but I'm putting that on my calendar to say, if the CEO pristinely protects his workouts, and if the CEO can be as vulnerable as to say, I need a moment, right, in the middle of the afternoon to be with my loved one, so can you. So we're gonna find our ways. The last piece is engineering for onboarding and engineering for training.
Establishing and perpetuating culture.
Well, that's I'm gonna get to, let me get to the culture piece real quick, because that was the thing I wanted to mention earlier. In a situation that we're in, I'll come to you next. Great, thanks. Just save you from getting a cramp. I got it. So the average, I'm here at Davos, and I'm talking to a lot of CEOs, and I'm advocating that they didn't reinvent work as they should, and now they're rushing to solve for the problem they think they have by forcing people back into the office 5 days a week. And I say, I don't care about that, but I do care that you haven't been curious enough to fundamentally reinvent work. And then they'll say to me, but you don't understand, culture degrades in a remote environment. Bonding and connectedness of my team degrades. And I said, and then they quote an Oxford study as if I'd never read it. And I say, well, I do know that Oxford study, and I took that data, and I asked the question, how many people that they surveyed, and it was statistically significant, but did they ask the question, when you moved from serendipitous culture that was created by walking down a hallway after a meeting or going to the lunch break room together, when you moved from that being the environment of creating culture and you moved into remote, tell me what practices you created that replaced that old creation of culture. And they look at me in the face, what do you mean? I said, well, what were the practices? How did you re-engineer work to be even more bonded and more connected in a remote environment? And they didn't. The teams that went into remote and said, holy shit, my team is no longer gonna be bonded. I need to create a new way to bond. And they created simple things like Drew Houston from Dropbox. On a weekly basis, every member of the team shares, what is my energy level 0 to 5? What am I stressed and strained about personally and professionally? Every member of the team goes around and shares that on a weekly basis. Now, what happened in that instance, the average relationship bonding score of a team pre-pandemic, because we have this metrics because we coach executive teams, the average team on a scale of 0 to 5, answering questions like, my team has my back, I care about my team cares for me, 2, the average score was a 2.8. During the pandemic, if you did not replace serendipitous culture with purposeful culture, that 2.8 went down to 2.3, which is what the Oxford study identified. But if you pulled out all the teams that did purposeful bonding exercises during the pandemic, the numbers all went up into the 4s. Because in the olden days, pre-pandemic, you only did serendipitous bonding. you only accidentally bumped into 2 people. But what if all of a sudden the whole damn team bonds, right? And makes a commitment to have each other's back? That translated to higher employee bonding and connectedness. So I get so damn pissed off by executives who quote these shitty, stupid studies that have not really been thought about in terms of the actual changing of the work, right? And so that's my challenge to executives, which is to figure out how we need to reinvent for the new world we're living in to make it even better than it was before. We can talk offline about onboarding and a number of other things.
I was at Microsoft for 7 years before my current role, and our saying was, we're like gladiators. We fight today, we get the shit kicked out of us. If we're lucky, we fight tomorrow. If not, we're dead. So that was the culture of it.
Well, and Satya has a different culture, doesn't he? And you see the performance that he's been able to create through that as well. Yeah.
We have the one in the back.
Oh, the lady in the back.
Just to add to what you were saying about like scheduling naps and things like that, it's crucial to lead from the top. I've found on stuff like this.
Nap from the top. That's going to be, yeah. That's the takeaway for today.
I run an all remote company of about 25 people, and sometimes people will reach out to me on the weekend about something, and I'll answer them, but it's to say, is there a reason you're working on the weekend? If you're not just doing something because you had a moment of inspiration and just had to get it out right now, please go enjoy your time off.
By the way, that enlightenment is the enlightenment and channeling my dear departed friend, Tony Hsieh, right? That is beautiful, and I admire leaders who are like that. I wished I could be, but I'll come back to that in a second. The similar thing goes, which is if you want to work for an organization where the executive team is always on the weekend, and where the executive team has made that social contract, and whether it's pay or whether it's impact, like for instance, we could look at organizations that do it because they're getting shitloads of shares and they're becoming unicorns and they're becoming millionaires, or we could also look at it for NGOs who are trying to change climate and they're doing the same thing on the weekend because they give a damn about impact. I don't care what the purpose is or the reason you're doing it, but it's perfectly acceptable if you're one of the two. You have to choose which environment you work in, right?
Yeah, and inspiration strikes where it will,
Yeah.
but people should also take comp time.
Yeah, no question. We all know that it's absolutely important to have that downtime and to take that vacation time, and that all of the studies prove that we need to have those breaks emotionally and physically. Yeah.
So Keith, you talked about Drew at Dropbox, Yeah, at
Dropbox, yeah.
And the 15% who have done things right. What are some other examples that you've thought this company just crushed it? They really cared about their workers, and they, transformed some of their processes or adopted new things that have made their score go up to a 4.
So there was a woman I was just introduced to here today. Her name is Rachel, and she's the CEO of a company called Guild, providing work pathing and development for the lowest level frontline employees and making sure that that is as strong as the development is given to knowledge workers. So credible lady, credible company, et cetera. One of the things that she did, first of all, many companies, they fortified their technology budget significantly as the pandemic hit. So they went out and they bought all the new Logitech stuff. They went out and bought all the Microsoft Teams stack or whatever it was. They bought everything, right? And they made sure that they'll even give you an allocation to make sure that you get broadband and fiber or whatever it is, right? They signed up for all the fancy bells and whistles, and they have a significant budget there. But they didn't have any budget allocated to figuring out how to work differently. What this woman did is she allocated a 4-person squad that full-time job was to reinvent every process in the business for remote first, right? It's a full-time 4-person squad. Not just, you're in HR, therefore some portion of your work has to be thinking about the future of work. No, this was a full-time 4-person squad. And I wanted to just stay there because it's so important. We struggle with figuring out the future of work because we've not spent enough time figuring out the future of work. If you had four full-time employees benchmarking, with other best class organizations and bringing all of that insight, and that's all they did, guess what? You would have figured all this stuff out. So the first thing I want to say is you're going to have to allocate a significant budget to the reinvention of your work, right? And that's not what's happening. What happens right now is every company takes their head of real estate, their head of HR, and their head of IT, and they are become the future of work team, and they meet once a week or once a month, but they meet for an hour, and you tell me that's going to be the curiosity that really gets under the hood? No, it's not. So that's the most important thing. I tip my hat to Rachel and CEOs like Drew, who really redesigned their work in the process. I wrote a book called Competing in the New World of Work, taking all of these best practices and putting them into a book during the pandemic. Published it with Harvard. It was their top pick coming out of the pandemic. So if you want a lot more of the tactics, you can get it from there. This is not a bait to say you have to get it from there, but I'm happy that if you want more resources, that's where you get it.
Absolutely. So I want to shift gears for a minute because you have such a great marketing and branding background as well, and you have talked about personal branding. It feels like Davos is all about personal branding. We are also now thinking about technologies like your point about, it's terrible, we just meet on Zoom. The metaverse that was showcased to us by companies who will not be named looked like a horrible experience. It was like, let's meet at a conference table in the metaverse, right? But those technologies are coming. Metaverse is coming, generative AI is coming. Those things are going to change how we think about our brands. And so any insights on how, individuals here should be thinking about it, or how we're seeing that next generation thinking about it when you can be anyone you want online or in the metaverse?
Right. Well, the first thing I would just ask any of you to ask yourselves right now is, what is your tagline for what you do and who you are and how you show up? So here you are at Zappos. Here you are at Davos. And you're having, hundreds of conversations, perhaps thousands of conversations this week, right? When somebody says, hi, how are you? And how do you work in what your mission is, what your passion is, and encapsulate that, right? Back in the day, I've always, and by the way, you don't have to have that for a lifetime. One of the things I used to say when I was at Davos was, I run a research institute for how to change human behavior. And it was just so provocative that someone's like, whoa, tell me more, right? And then I would talk to them, my application is that I coach executive teams, but ultimately I'm trying to change human behavior, and our research institute, which focuses on high-performing teams, is all about how do you get a team to become high-performing. But the question is, what's your grab, what's your tagline, right? And I think, if you're not walking around here without that draws somebody into the next conversation, you're going to be engaged in way too many conversations where as soon as you start to talk, people are looking around for the person that they wish they were talking to, right? So your personal brand starts with that, having that hook from the very beginning of a conversation. And then, of course, that goes into every part of your life. It goes on to then you need to ask yourself, that's who I am, then what am I delivering to people in my content that I'm writing? How am I being of service? Look, the one thing I learned a long time ago is that marketing is nothing more than radical generosity. If you want to be a great marketer, you just got to figure out how deeply generous you can be to the people who you wish you had the opportunity to serve, right? So at Starwood Hotels, when we were looking at how to make a difference, it actually happened, it's a little funny story, I'll tell it here. We were here at Davos, and my chairman and I, who's brilliant, great innovator, we were staying at one of these hotels, and we got into breakfast the following morning, and both of us said we both had the best night's sleep we've ever had. What was it that was that? And it was interesting. There were these crappy beds, but then there was a comforter on top of the bed, and then you got on top of that comforter, and then you put another comforter on top of you. I don't know if that's a Swiss tradition, but It was amazing. It was like I was in this little marshmallow, little huggy thing. It was fantastic. It was really heavenly, right? And we came down and we started talking about that. And we were thinking, wow, wouldn't it be great for all beds? We're like, why do we have beds at Sheridan that have these paisley comforters on them? We need to be having these beautiful heavenly beds. Well, we went back and talked to the head of operations and said, we need to do these heavenly beds. We didn't have the brand yet, but ultimately we called them heavenly beds, if anybody was followers of Weston and that sort of thing. We said, we need to have these heavenly beds. And the head of operations, like, we were not hoteliers. My CEO wasn't a hotelier. I wasn't a hotelier. The head of operations sort of tapped us on the head and was like, oh, how cute. Do you realize how expensive that would be to have white comforters on your sheets? I mean, on your beds. And I was like, wait a second, expensive? What do you mean? Like, well, we don't wash those every day. And I was like, that's so gross. We don't wash our comforters. Right? And we said, figure out, we got to fix that, first of all. Figure out how do we do this white thing? Well, it ended up being cheaper because the washing process for those comforters was much more expensive than just bleaching sheets that got put in on top of a beautiful, fluffy feather thing. So it was interesting. Why do I share this story? There are these kind of innovations in every organization that are not getting to the forefront, right? And that are being capped. I ask everybody in this room, where are your paisley comforters? Where are the things that you've just always done, that you consistently do, that you fundamentally need to reinvent in order to be of deeply generous service? The heavenly bed became the reason everybody loved Weston, right? If you're a marketer in your brand, serve everybody. So when you go to these events, know what your hook is, but then your question is, can you extract in your conversation what their hook is? And then could you figure out a way to be of service to them? If you're the person walking around Davos always asking, how can I be of service to the people I meet? Your brand, I mean, it's interesting. Somebody was with me the other day and said, everybody knows you. And the reality is, since 1996, which was probably my first Davos, I've consistently tried to show up and be of service to people here at Davos. And as a result, I've become the super connector with the super brand. And then as a result, I know everybody. And that ability to be at the nexus, it's all about being of service.
All right. Any final questions for Keith before while we still have him?
Yep.
Chief Staff Association, we do webinars, lots of them. Keith's been on those. We have members all over the world. So for someone, it's 2 in the morning, and it's nasty. As much energy as Keith brings to the conversation, as much as I try to bring to the conversation, for someone it's 2 in the morning. And we had a choice. We either said, sorry, then don't join, or, which is what we've done, we committed a fair bit of money to start pre-recording, build a library of content, say, we'll serve you up that content when you need it. That was a fundamental decision that we couldn't go any way on. And that's the choice we made.
And the other thing that if you're going to be forcing people into these town halls, right? Remember the idea, I believe you can shift a lot of those outside of a physical synchronous meeting gathering. But if you're going to bring people together, make sure that you're constantly asking the question, how are people engaging with each other? And they won't be engaging if they're listening to a report out. They won't be engaging if they're listening to somebody present. Constantly throwing them into breakout rooms wakes them up. They're engaged with 3 individuals, and their participation is really the earmark of an individual's belief that this meeting was worthwhile. Not just hearing, droning on and on and on, which is what, of course, I've been doing to you this entire time. So thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Keith. We appreciate it.